I need you guys to look at something. This is a skull, and if you look right here on the forehead, you can see 4 marks. Now these are not scratches and they're not cracks from age. These are chop marks from a blade. Whoever made these was trying to break through the skull and they failed, so they tried again and again and again. Now these marks are from 1609 and they were found in a fort in Virginia, inside the first permanent English colony, and the bones belong to a 14-year-old girl. She wasn't killed by an enemy, she was eaten by the people she was sent to live with. And if that wasn't disturbing enough, 300 people walked into that winter. Only 60 walked out. And then they nearly lost those people as well. So in 1607, the Virginia Company of London sends 104 men and boys across the Atlantic to establish a colony, Jamestown, named after King James, America's first permanent English settlement. And it was a disaster from day one. Now, to understand why what happened later was even possible, you need to understand who these men actually were. Because out of those 104 colonists, about 35 of them were classified as gentlemen. And in 1607, a gentleman wasn't just a polite man, it was a social class. These were men who had never done manual labour in their entire lives. They didn't know how to farm. They didn't know how to build, they didn't know how to hunt, and the Virginia Company sent them into the wilderness of North America and expected them to survive. And the location that they chose was terrible. I mean, it was essentially a swamp. The water from the James River was brackish, which means it was a mix of salt water and fresh water, and it was genuinely dangerous to drink. There were mosquitoes everywhere, and local Powhatan people, they hadn't exactly invited these English settlers to move in. Now, one man held this whole operation together. His name was Captain John Smith, and Smith had a very famous rule. He basically said, if you don't work, you don't eat. And he later wrote something that I think is one of the most revealing quotes of this entire period. He said that the labours of 30 or 40 honest and industrious men were being consumed to maintain 150 idle loiterers. I mean, think about it. 30 guys doing all of the work to keep 150 people alive who refuse to lift a finger. That ratio tells you everything you need to know about why this colony was a ticking time bomb. And by the end of the first year, 66 of those original 104 colonists were dead. Disease, starvation, conflict with the Powhatan. I mean, this place was already failing. And then in 1609, 2 things happened almost exactly at the same time that turned a struggling colony into a death trap. First, John Smith, the one who was keeping everybody alive. He was badly burned in a gunpowder accident and had to be shipped back to England, so the leadership was gone. And second, the Virginia Company sent the largest fleet ever dispatched to the Americas. 9 ships, 600 passengers, a full year's worth of supplies, a new governor, everything the colony needed to survive. And then a hurricane hit the fleet in the middle of the Atlantic, and the flagship, the Sea Venture, which was carrying the new governor, all the new senior leadership, and the bulk of the supplies, it just vanished. Nobody knew if it sank or where it went. The other 8 ships limped into Jamestown, carrying hundreds of new colonists, but no leader, no plan, and almost no supplies. Just more mouths to feed in a colony that was already starving. Now, if you're keeping track of what just happened, the colony that was already failing just lost its leader, gained hundreds of extra people, and lost its entire supply line, all in the same month. Then the Powhatan laid siege to the fort. November 1609, armed warriors outside of the walls, nobody could leave, nobody could forage, nobody could trade. Tree ring data later confirmed what the colonists could not have known. They were living through the worst drought in 770 years. Scientists tested the oyster shells from the James River and found that the salinity near the fort was at 16 units. Normal is between 3 and 10. The river that they were drinking was poison. 300 people locked inside of a wooden fort. No food, no clean water, and no way out. Winter was starting. Now remember that skull that I showed you at the beginning? That came from inside this fort, and we're about to walk through exactly what happened month by month, because what turns a colony into a place where you eat a 14-year-old girl isn't just one moment in time. It's a process, a slow collapse, where every week is worse than the last. Now, remember that flagship that vanished in the hurricane, the Sea Venture? It didn't actually sink. It crashed into a reef off of the coast of Bermuda. And here's the thing, all 150 passengers survived. Every single one of them made it to shore. And what they did next was actually pretty incredible. They salvaged what they could. They spent 10 months cutting Bermuda cedar and built 2 entirely new ships, the Patience and the Deliverance. The new governor, Thomas Gates, was on that island the entire time. He had no idea what was happening at Jamestown. And the people at Jamestown had no idea anybody had survived that hurricane. Imagine being inside of that fort. Your leader is gone. Your supply ship sank. The fleet that was supposed to save you is at the bottom of the Atlantic, as far as you know, and nobody is coming. George Percy, now acting president, his first act was maths. He calculated the remaining food. Half a can of a meal per person per day, enough for 3 months. If stretched, 4. 4 months of food for 300 people in a fort that they could not leave. Percy then sent out trading parties to negotiate food with the Powhatan. One of them was led by John Ratcliffe, a former colony president. The Powhatan lured his party into an ambush. Ratcliffe was tied naked to a tree and flayed alive with mussel shells. His wife and children were killed. The English arrived in Virginia with metal blades. Their leader was killed by mussel shells. That detail has stayed with me since I first read it. After Ratcliffe, nobody left the fort. The palisade walls became a boundary of their entire world. Armed Powhatan outside, drought-poisoned water inside, dysentery spreading through the camp. The fort became a sealed box, and the people inside it were about to discover how far human beings would go when the food runs out. December 1609. The horses went first. And I know that sounds straightforward, but think about what this actually means. These were not wild horses that they hunted. These were the working animals, their transportation, their ability to move anything heavy. Killing the horses meant giving up the ability to work, to build, to defend the fort. And they did it anyway because they had to eat. Then the dogs, then the cats. Every living animal inside of those walls was slaughtered and consumed. And then they did something that tells you just how desperate things were really getting, even at this early stage. They started trading away their tools and their weapons to the Powhatan in exchange for whatever scraps of food they could get. They were literally disarming themselves while under siege. That's how hungry they were. And I want you to do a quick bit of maths here, because it really puts things into perspective. 300 people, a few horses, a handful of dogs. How long do you think that food actually lasts? Days? Maybe a week or two at most, if they rationed? And then it's gone, and the winter isn't even halfway done. January 1610. Now once the livestock was gone, they moved to the next tier. Rats, mice, anything that moved inside of the fort walls. And George Percy, who was there, who wrote about this later, he lists what they ate in this order. And the way he lists it is actually really telling. He writes vermin as dogs and cats, rats and mice, all in one breath. as if by this point the distinction between a pet and a pest had completely collapsed. It was just all meat. And then, after the rats and the mice were gone, they moved on to those things that aren't really food at all. Boots, shoes, any piece of leather in the fort was boiled and chewed until it could be swallowed. And then starch. John Smith recorded that people ate the starch used to stiffen their clothing, the paste that keeps their clothes stiff and their shirts pressed. Laundry supplies became dinner. The starch detail is one that made me realise how insane this whole situation was. They weren't running out of food, they were running out of things that they could pretend was food. February 1610. Percy's accounts crosses a line here that most retellings skip. He writes that some colonists licked up the blood which hath fallen from their weak fellows. Not a metaphor. Percy presents this as literal behaviour. People so calorie depleted, they consumed the blood from the wounds and sores of the people dying around them. The Minnesota starvation experiment, the most detailed study ever conducted on prolonged food deprivation, documented what happens to the human mind under these conditions. Food preoccupation that becomes obsessive, depression, irritability, apathy, social withdrawal, impaired decision-making. The brain begins shutting down non-essential functions to conserve energy. The colonists weren't making rational choices anymore. They couldn't. Their minds were breaking alongside their bodies. March 1610. Smith's account. A Saluge we slew and buried. The poorer sort took him up again and eat him. They dug up the buried dead and ate them. Percy confirms this separately. Colonists dig up dead corpses out of graves and eat them. Two independent writers, the same account. The living were eating the dead. The taboo ladder had finally been climbed. Living animals, dead animals, objects, bodily fluids, and now human remains. Did every colonist resort to this? Almost certainly not, but enough people did it that in two separate writers independently documented it. This wasn't a rumour, it was witnessed. And then there's a story that even the Virginia Company couldn't hide. The powdered wife. A man killed his pregnant wife, cut her apart, salted the pieces, powdered her. In the language of the time, salting means to preserve it, and then he ate parts of her. Now, Percy's account includes what happened next. The man was arrested. He was hung by his thumbs and weights attached to his feet, and then he was executed. But the Virginia Company's own investigation found something else. When they searched his house, they found hidden stores. Meal, oatmeal, beans, peas. He had food. The company concluded it was just murder, disguised as desperation. He killed his wife and used the famine as cover. That twist, the hidden food, changes everything about this story. Because now you're not just asking what starvation does to people. You're asking what people do when they know nobody is watching. When the rules have already collapsed. When the person next to you might be dying or might be dangerous and you can't tell the difference anymore. The worst act of the starving time might not have been starvation at all. May 1610. By spring, 60 people were still alive. Out of about roughly 300, the fort was barely standing. Palisades torn down for firewood, gates ripped off of their hinges, food stores completely empty. When rescue finally came, what they found didn't look like a colony anymore. It looked like a graveyard that still had a few people in it. Now, everything I've just told you comes from written accounts, letters, reports, histories written by people who were either there or had heard about it from people who were. And for 400 years, that's all anyone had. Words on a page. And the problem with words on a page, especially words from the 1600s, is that people can dismiss them. and they did. Historians argued about whether Percy was reliable, whether Smith was exaggerating to make his rivals look bad, whether the Virginia Company fabricated stories to deflect blame. The cannibalism at Jamestown existed in a grey area between history and rumour. Nobody could prove it, nobody could disprove it. And then in 2012, 403 years after Starving Time, that changed. Archaeologists from Jamestown Rediscovery Project were excavating inside what's left of James Fort. In an L-shaped cellar, a 17th century trash deposit, they found bones, a partial skull, a shin bone mixed in with shells, pottery, and butchered animal remains. William Kelso, the project director, later said that they found partial human remains before, but the location, the visible damage, the marks on these bones were immediately different. The bones were sent to Douglas Owsley, head of the physical anthropology at the Smithsonian's National History Museum. She was approximately 14 years old, determined by her teeth, third molars still forming, roots incomplete. The growth plate on her knee was just beginning to fuse. A child's body still in the process of becoming an adult's. She was female, determined by the shape of her skull, specific bone formations consistent with a young female. Isotope analysis of her teeth told them where she came from. The chemical signature of her childhood diet pointed to the coastal plains of southern England. Wheat, not corn, a European diet. She'd only recently arrived in Virginia. A girl from England, 14 years old, sent across the Atlantic to a colony that was about to collapse. Then Owsley examined the marks. The forehead, 4 chop marks, shallow, tentative. Whoever held the blade tried to break through the skull and failed 4 times. The cuts show zero confidence, no experience, no clear pattern. The back of the head, deeper. Then the skull cracked along the midline, then a small rectangular tool, not a knife, something flat, punched through the left temple, prying the bone apart to reach the brain inside. The right cheek, fine cuts just below the eye socket, small, precise, relative to the forehead attempts, removing the cheek muscles from the bone. The jaw, numerous cuts and punctures, quick soaring motions, no clear pattern. The forensic report uses the same word used for the forehead: tentative, inexperienced. The right shin bone, a single chop from behind, below the knee. The blade entered and broke the shaft halfway through, exposing marrow inside. She was found alongside butchered animal bones, horses, dogs. She was processed in the same way as the animals, in the same deposit. At the same time, the word that keeps coming up in the forensic report is tentative. The cuts on her forehead, the soaring of her jaw. Whoever did this had never done it before, and you could see it on the bone. You can literally see them hesitating. The Smithsonian created a facial reconstruction using the skull fragments. Owsley's team rebuilt her face. Her name was Jane. Not the real name, nobody recorded that. But the research gave it to her because she deserved to be more than just a catalogue number. She looked young. She was someone's daughter. Because she was. On May 1st, 2013, the finding was publicly announced. The first scientifically proven case of survival cannibalism in colonial America. DNA samples were saved from her remains, but the researchers said there was little hope of ever identifying her family. 400 years, the written accounts of cannibalism at Jamestown have been dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration, politically motivated lies. Percy was unreliable, Smith was self-serving. The Virginia Company fabricated stories. Then this 14-year-old girl's bones settled the argument. Now, I mentioned at the very beginning that 60 people survived the starving time, but I also said that they were nearly lost as well. And this is what I was talking about. May 24th, 1610. 10 months after the hurricane, 2 ships sail into the James River, the Patience and the Deliverance, both built from Bermuda cedar by the survivors of the Sea Venture wreck. Thomas Gates, the governor who was supposed to arrive a year later, steps ashore at Jamestown for the first time. What he found: 60 survivors, the fort destroyed, palisades torn apart for firewood, structures collapsing. The people who walked out of that winter were not the same people who walked in. Gates had spent 10 months building ships in Bermuda, sailing to Virginia, expecting to find a colony. He found a graveyard. Gates made the decision to abandon Jamestown. It's completely over. Load everyone back onto the ships and leave Virginia. Go home. They boarded the ships and they sailed down the James River, away from the fort, away from Virginia, away from everything they'd suffered for. Jamestown was now empty. The first permanent English colony of America had been abandoned. They were gone. The fort was empty. And if this is where the story ended, there's no Virginia, there's no Jamestown. The entire timeline of English colonization of America shifts, maybe by years, maybe by decades. Everything that followed: tobacco economy, the expansion south, eventually the revolution. All of it starts here, in the fort, with these people, and they had just left. June 8th, 1610. On the river, Gates' ships heading to the open sea, and then they encounter an incoming fleet. Thomas West, Lord de la Warr, carrying fresh supplies, fresh colonists, and orders from the Virginia Company to keep the colony alive at all costs. They turned the ships around and sailed back up James River. De la Warr reached Jamestown on June 10th. If De la Warr had been delayed, even by days, the ships would have been past the river's mouth and into the Atlantic. There would have been no interception, no return, no colony. The largest English settlement in North America was saved by an accident of timing. A few days' difference, and 400 years of history would look completely different. The Virginia Company's response to the starving time was not grief though, it was damage control. In 1610, they published a true declaration. Its purpose, in its own words, was to confute the scandalous reports that were destroying investor confidence. The strategy: reframe cannibalism as individual criminal behaviour, not a systematic failure. Blame idleness, blame pirates spreading rumours, protect the investment at all costs and keep the money flowing. The Virginia Company ran a public relations campaign to cover up the worst winter in American colonial history, and it worked. For 400 years, Percy's account wasn't published in his lifetime. Smith wasn't there during the winter and had every reason to exaggerate his rival's failures. The horror of starving time existed in a grey area between history and propaganda until 2012, when they found a girl with cut marks on her skull, 14 years old, from southern England, sent to a colony that ate her. Her name is Jane and she's displayed at the Arcarium at historic Jamestown. Visitors can see her face. This one stays with you. Not the blood, not the graves, not even the wife. The hesitation marks. 4 chop marks on a 14-year-old girl's forehead. Shallow, tentative. Whoever held that blade didn't want to do what they were about to do, but they did it anyway. And that tells you everything about what happened inside of those walls. This one is brutal, guys, but it's a massive historic event that was fascinating to learn about. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe to Buried Earth. My name's Joe, and on screen right now, 2 videos I think you're going to want to see next.